Rome, 37 AD. The man hailed as savior held a secret. He preferred shadows to sunshine and silence to applause. You think you know Roman depravity? You haven't considered what happens when a god is given a key to every bedroom in the empire. The marble halls of Palatine Hill were soon sticky, not with wine, but with the pervasive, unsettling odor of fear. Imagine being a woman whose destiny was decided by the fickle, theatrical whim of one man, immune to law. Caligula's first acts were clemency. His final acts were performances of malice that shocked even the hardened Senate. You stand now at the threshold of the Palatine Hill, where the very concept of Roman dignity began to fray under the relentless pressure of one man's ascendancy. This isn't the Rome of stoic senators or triumphant legions. This is the Rome of Gaius Caesar Germanicus, known to history as Caligula. His name, a diminutive meaning little boot, belied the gigantic, terrifying scope of his ambition and the dark theater he constructed within the very heart of the state. We enter a period where the emperor's home, the Domus Tiberiana, ceased to be merely a palace and was slowly, deliberately transformed into a stage for psychological ritual and unchecked power. The atmosphere here, even 2 millennia later, feels dense, heavy with the silent suffering of those who were trapped within its golden walls. The stakes were immediate and absolute upon his ascension in 37 AD. The people loved him. They saw in the young, orphaned son of Germanicus a promise of the Republic's rebirth, a contrast to the austere darkness of Tiberius. But this wasn't the end. The expectation of benevolence created a fragile, high-wire act for everyone surrounding him, especially the elite families whose daughters were pawns in the game of imperial favor. You had to measure every glance, every compliment, every silence, knowing that a single misstep could lead to complete ruin, not just for yourself, but for your entire lineage. The transition from beloved heir to capricious tyrant was swift, subtle at first, manifesting in small, unsettling shifts in his daily routines and demands. The architectural details of the palace itself became complicit in the narrative of surveillance and control. Caligula reportedly installed hidden peepholes and reflective surfaces throughout the Domus Tiberiana, transforming corridors of power into avenues of paranoia. Imagine the shadows lengthening across the polished marble, not just from the setting sun, but from the realization that every private conversation, every whispered complaint might be overheard by the emperor's spies. The very light, which in Rome symbolized virtue and exposure, became an instrument of intimidation. Brightly lit rooms where senators were humiliated, or sudden darkness where decisions of life and death were rendered without explanation. The focus of his evolving cruelty often fell, with particular severity, upon women. For the powerful Roman male, status was derived from conquest and public display. For the women of the imperial court, status was a delicate, shifting commodity based entirely on proximity to the emperor's favor or displeasure. Wives of senators, vestal virgins, and even his own sisters found themselves caught in a cycle where their dignity was systematically violated to satisfy his increasingly theatrical sense of dominance. The palace became a kind of perverse laboratory where the limits of imperial impunity were constantly being tested against the constraints of Roman tradition and familial honor. Historical accounts, often filtered through the biases of his successors, paint a picture of an emperor driven by an almost pathological need to shock and dismantle established norms. This wasn't mere hedonism. It was a deliberate performance intended to prove that he was above the laws of man and the restraints of morality. We must understand that in the Roman worldview, an emperor's behavior was often seen as a reflection of the state's health. Caligula's decline signaled a profound systemic sickness, where ritual and social structure were actively undermined by the very person sworn to uphold them. Consider the ritualistic nature of his power plays. He wouldn't simply condemn a man. He would often focus his severity upon the man's wife or daughter first, using their vulnerability as leverage. This shift in focus from public political enemies to private domestic targets deepened the pervasive atmosphere of terror. You, the citizen, were safe only if your family was beneath the emperor's notice. a virtually impossible state for anyone of patrician standing. The constant state of anxiety, the waiting for the next theatrical decree, wore down the moral foundations of the entire court. The grand banquets, meant to symbolize Roman plenty and peace, transformed into veiled auditions and stages for public degradation. Imagine the forced smiles, the metallic taste of fear mingling with expensive wine, as Caligula would capriciously elevate or utterly destroy a guest based on a momentary whim. For the women forced to attend, these events were not celebrations, but highly controlled exercises in maintaining composure, knowing they were under intense scrutiny. The very air was thick with unspoken tension, a silent promise of the purge that might follow the feast. Among the objects that defined this era was the emperor's magnificent, absurdly decorated trireme, his personal floating palace on Lake Nemi. This ship, recovered centuries later, represented his desire to isolate himself in opulent, self-made worlds, physically removing himself from the constraints of Rome while metaphorically tightening his grip on it. It was here, in places removed from the watchful eyes of the Senate, that some of the most profound violations of dignity and status occurred, cementing his reputation as the unhinged architect of psychological warfare. His relationships with his own sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Drusilla, and Livilla, were central to his narrative of ritualistic power. Drusilla in particular was elevated to a near-divine status, a mirror of his own claim to godhood, even after her tragic and swift end. This incestuous dynamic wasn't just a violation of Roman morals. It was a powerful political statement that proclaimed the imperial family was a law unto itself, forging its own sacred, untouchable bloodlines above the plebeian constraints of tradition. The historical record suggests that Caligula demanded that his sisters be included in the formal vows of allegiance sworn by Roman officials, a profoundly shocking usurpation of power traditionally reserved for the emperor and the gods. You can visualize the grim expressions of the senators, their hands raised in an oath that felt like a public surrender of their masculine authority to the whims of the emperor and the very women they were supposed to govern. The psychological impact of this enforced ritual eroded the final vestiges of senatorial pride. Prominent at the peak of his instability, there was an almost unbearable suspense to his actions. One day he would lavish gifts upon a favored companion. The next, she would be utterly stripped of wealth and banished without cause. This unpredictability, the constant oscillation between excessive reward and severe suffering, was a deliberate tool of control. What came next changed everything. It ensured that no one felt truly secure, not even his closest confidants, amplifying the collective nervousness that permeated the capital. Consider the case of the marriages he forced or dissolved at a moment's notice. He viewed high-born Roman women as property to be exchanged, used to humiliate rivals or to elevate favorites. One narrative recounts how he forced a senator to divorce his wife immediately so that Caligula himself could marry her, only to divorce her days later and return her, now irrevocably tainted, to her husband. The act wasn't about affection. It was a public shaming of the man, executed through the violation of his spouse's dignity. The atmosphere within the palace became so toxic that the courtiers adopted an etiquette of extreme flattery, praising even the most irrational or destructive decisions. They had learned that disagreement was not debated, but condemned. This environment created a feedback loop of escalating cruelty. The more the emperor's erratic behavior was praised, the further he pushed the boundaries, seeking new heights of theatrical malice to test the depths of his followers' subservience. We must look beyond the simplified accounts of madness and recognize the political calculation inherent in his theatrical violence. Caligula understood that fear is a more reliable currency than loyalty. By targeting the high-born wives and daughters, he struck at the emotional core of the Roman aristocracy, demonstrating that their public titles and ancient lineage offered no protection against the arbitrary will of the divine emperor. This was power defined not by law, but by performance. Think of the Cryptoporticus, the underground corridor that linked the various imperial residences on the Palatine. It was here, in the cool, silent subterranean passages, where plots were hatched and fear traveled fastest.
While the sun shone brightly on the forums outside, the real decisions, the whispers of who was next to meet a tragic end or face severe suffering, were exchanged in the deliberate half-light of these closed-off spaces. The physical isolation mirrored the emperor's psychological separation from Roman society. The ultimate expression of his absolute power involved transforming the women of the court into participants in his perverse rituals. They were not merely victims, but often forced to participate in public displays that stripped them of their modesty and status,
all under the guise of imperial command. The goal was to remove all barriers, moral and social, between the ruler and the ruled, proving that the emperor was the only source of authority, and that even the most sacred bonds of Roman womanhood were subject to his decree. The climax of this period of intense psychological terror centered on the growing realization that Caligula saw himself not just as a successor to Augustus, but as an actual deity walking among men. He famously ordered statues of gods to have their heads replaced with his own likeness, forcing Romans to worship his image. This divine conceit exacerbated his cruelty, providing a terrifying justification for his actions. Gods do not require mortal permission or adhere to earthly laws. His public treatment of his eventual wife, Caesonia, differed from his usual casual abuse. She was a woman known for her exotic confidence and, perhaps more importantly, her ability to manage and control the uncontrollable emperor. Yet, even with her, the cruelty was woven into the relationship, defined by Caligula's need to demonstrate that even his deepest attachments were secondary to his power. Their bond was a strange, toxic refuge from the chaos he created for everyone else. The Senate, long accustomed to maneuvering within the boundaries of constitutional law, found themselves utterly paralyzed. The source of their authority, tradition, and the gravitas of their lineage was precisely what Caligula sought to dismantle. They were forced into a humiliating role, often compelled to praise the very actions that threatened their lives and the lives of their families. Their resistance was reduced to whispered conspiracies in the silent corners of the basilica. We see the Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty should have been to the state, now acting as Caligula's personal instruments of purge. Their polished bronze armor, meant to symbolize Roman defense, now reflected the chilling gleam of imperial terror.